Hello, hello, wonderful to have you here. In today's video, what I want to do is to discuss Buddhism, early Buddhism, and loneliness or solitude. I had a question a while back by Rudolf Fischer who asks me to do a video on Buddhism and loneliness in particular. Now, in fact, the Buddha doesn't have much to say, to my knowledge, about loneliness per se, but he does have a lot to say about solitude. And there is a close relationship between loneliness on the one hand and solitude on the other. And indeed, some of what we can learn, I think, from the Buddha's teachings on solitude can help us to maybe reframe the problem of loneliness in ways that will be helpful. And then I'll get around later on in the video as well to some issues about loneliness itself. So what about solitude? Well, I did a recent video where I discussed Mahakassapa, an early devotee, practitioner, one of the Buddha's major disciples, where he wrote a poem about his experience being alone, or essentially alone, in the wilderness. And here is a section of that poem. What he said was this: "The rain comes down on the lovely flats in the mountains frequented by hermits. Echoing with the cries of peacocks, these rocky crags delight me. Empty of householders, frequented by herds of deer, full of flocks of many different birds, these rocky crags delight me." Now, this is just a short selection from a much longer poem, but the poem goes on in a similar vein. And I think we get the point here. What Mahakassapa is doing here is to praise this kind of aloneness in the wilderness. Now, to be fair, he's not completely alone. There are hermits here and there. Presumably these hermits really wouldn't want to be bothered, so you're pretty close to being alone. But you do have the company of other animals. Again, not a huge amount of company because the animals are going to be keeping their distance on them for the most part. But you get the picture. It's a happy aloneness, a happy solitude, not a lonely type of solitude. In another early sutta that I mentioned recently in another video, the Buddha talks about various aspects of his teaching that we should keep in mind if we want to practice properly. And one of those aspects is that we should be pursuing the sorts of things that lead to solitude rather than to crowding. In other words, that lead to our liking, enjoying being alone, rather than our tending to enjoy being in large groups of people. In yet another early sutta, it's said that the Buddha, when he was wandering around an alms round, noticed that a large number of his monastics were staying at the household of a man named Kalakemaka the Sakya, who seems to have been a wealthy individual in the Buddha's own larger family group, who had a big house, and a lot of his monastics were staying there, as I say. And so the Buddha asked Ananda, his attendant, his close attendant, what was going on here? Why were all of these monastics staying at this house? And Ananda said that they were there in order to sew robes. There was a particular time of the year, every year, when monastics would get together, or at least on their own, to sew robes, to re-sew, to fix, mend robes for themselves for the year. And again, as I was saying, they were doing it in this house. However, the Buddha was not happy about that. In particular, he wasn't happy with what he saw as this kind of large-scale socializing and fraternizing among the different monks. What he had to say was this: "Ananda, a mendicant doesn't shine who enjoys company in groups, who loves them and likes to enjoy them. It's simply not possible that such a mendicant will get the pleasure of renunciation, the pleasure of seclusion, the pleasure of peace, the pleasure of awakening when they want without trouble or difficulty. But you should expect that a mendicant who lives alone, withdrawn from the group, will get the pleasure of renunciation, the pleasure of seclusion, the pleasure of peace, the pleasure of awakening when they want without trouble or difficulty. That is possible. And then in this sutta, the Buddha goes on to say that this kind of approach to our lives, an approach that promotes seclusion, is one that tends to lead naturally to practices of emptiness, which are deep meditative practices that are very helpful along the path to awakening or enlightenment. Now, is all of this that I've just said, is this an adequate response to people who feel lonely? Well, it's a response a helpful response in one respect, in that it points out that there are advantages, great advantages according to the Buddha, with being alone, with being isolated, with being away from the group. In particular, it allows us the freedom and the calm to pursue practices such as deep meditation, to, let's say, pursue practices such as wisdom practices, getting to understand the world more. We're less distracted. We can pursue other kinds of personal betterment practices, such as, let's say, exercise we can do by ourselves if we have time. We can use the time to work, to study. There are many benefits to being alone. So one reframing of loneliness is to see loneliness as less a problem and more of an opportunity, something that we can do with it. It's not the sort of thing that we should see as legitimately bad, but simply as something that we can work with. Aloneness can be seen as a gift. And there are advantages as well to being with other people. And to this extent, there is something of a tension in the early suttas when it comes to this question. I wouldn't say it's a contradiction, but it's something of a tension. So, for example, in one early sutta, the Buddha's attendant Ananda says to him that good friends, good companions are half of the holy life, or the life of practice. And when the Buddha hears this, the Buddha implores him that that's not the case. He implores you, I implore you not to think that way. The Buddha says that indeed having good companions, good spiritual friends, is all of the life of practice, is all of the holy life. That is to say that good friends, good spiritual companions are people who help to teach us, people who help to keep us on the straight and narrow, as it were, who help to point the way for us, who keep us company. Now, how do we reconcile these two, what seem to be somewhat different approaches in early Buddhism? The approach on the one hand of solitude, and the approach on the other hand of the importance of spiritual friendship. Well, I think we can find a way to reconcile these two teachings in an early poem, one of the poems that's considered one of the earliest within the early Buddhist tradition, which is the poem on the rhinoceros horn, or the rhinoceros. This is a poem that seems to originate from a very early time in the Buddha's teaching career, when he was out wandering alone in the wilderness, not accompanied by anybody. And indeed, it's a poem that extols this kind of life of the solitary, itinerant sort of wanderer around the countryside, who wanders alone like a rhinoceros horn, or like a solitary rhinoceros out in the woods. However, within that poem, we do find a few what we might call divergent kinds of verses. In particular, he says this: "If you find an alert companion, a wise and virtuous friend, then, overcoming all adversities, wander with them, joyful and mindful." That is to say that although many of our interactions with other people involve various kinds of frictions and disagreements, if we can find a wonderful companion, a wise companion to keep us company, that person is like a jewel, and we should hold on to them in the sense of trying to stay with them, because they can be helpful to us along that path. So in the early suttas, the Buddha comes across as a natural introvert, as somebody who is much more comfortable being alone, or relatively alone, with a very small group of people, rather than somebody being in large crowds or being particularly popular. And he doesn't seem to have loved the kind of popularity that came with his fame later on in life. However, all that I've been speaking of so far doesn't quite get at the aspects of loneliness that are so important for so many people. In particular, I'll point to two aspects, one being the depression of loneliness, and the other being the anxiety, I think, of loneliness. Now, depression on the one hand it can be a very debilitating mental state. It's one in which we are less able to work to our own good benefit. Oftentimes, depression is associated with various forms of self-hatred. I did an earlier video on the topic of self-hatred generally in Buddhism, and I'll leave a link to that down below in the notes. In particular, this is a video that talks about the Dalai Lama's confusions over this whole idea. But depression, if it gets to a certain stage of seriousness, is the sort of thing that we should look to professional help to deal with. Find a psychologist or a therapist who can help us, even for a few weeks or longer if we need it. That can help get us out of that rut so that we can begin to get back on the path. I think that's very important to realize, that we may not be able to get out of that ourselves necessarily if it's bad enough. The anxiety, on the other hand, is often, I think, when it comes to loneliness, often an anxiety, a fear of other people, of not really understanding or feeling that we don't understand other people properly, of not feeling like we fit in. And this is something that many of us introverts will probably be able to understand. If you're not an introvert, this may seem foreign to you, but I am an introvert, and so this is something that I am familiar with. And the Buddha does recommend practices, or at least, shall we say, there are some practices recommended in commentaries to the early texts that can be very helpful when it comes to dealing with anxiety and fear. In particular, there's one early commentary in which it's said that the Buddha recommended that a number of monks go off and meditate in a distant forest. This was probably the sort of thing that the Buddha would have recommended. In fact, we do have examples in the Suttas where the Buddha did recommend that his monastics go off and meditate or practice in other places. This is one of the ways that the Buddha expanded the reach of the Dharma, by sending out these kind of emissaries. But in any event, these monks went out to a distant forest and spent a while there, and then returned to the Buddha rather sooner than the Buddha had expected. And these monks said that they were afraid, that when they were meditating in these forests at night, they were struck down with fear by what they termed the sort of forest deities that were not happy with them being there at night. I think we can sort of understand this, or at least I would understand this, as a natural kind of fear and anxiety that comes from being out at night in a forest that we're not familiar with. All of the sounds of the forest at night would have been potentially terrifying. And at least in this commentary, it says that the Buddha recommended a certain group of practices that the monastics should undertake in order to overcome their fear and in order to placate these forest deities. And these practices were indeed the practices of what is known as metta, or loving kindness. In early Buddhism, and indeed in Buddhism down to the present day, these practices of what are known as the Brahma Viharas, of loving kindness, of compassion, of sympathetic joy, and of equanimity, are seen as protective practices. That is to say, they're seen as having a kind of a protective effect upon us that can allow us to overcome potential fearful situations. Another way to look at it is that they are protective in the sense that they relieve us from fear and anxiety, or at least that's the way they can work, by seeing the world as essentially more benign to us than we might ordinarily think of it that way. We think of the world oftentimes as being dangerous. However, if we undertake practices of kindness, that can help reframe the way that we picture the world and understand it in a much more benign way. And this practice then can be a very effective antidote against anxiety and fear, and may even be a potential antidote against depression sometimes for the same reason. By lifting up the mind, by getting the mind out of its tendency to be negative and fearful and turn it towards something more positive. There are other practices as well that are very useful in that regard, such as a general mindfulness practice that allows us to calm down and become more mindful of the way the world and we are interacting with each other, just to simply calm and look. And also, I think, practices of exercise, regular daily exercise, wherever we can get it, can also really be helpful in uplifting the mind and, I think, turning us away from our ordinary depressive ways of thinking of things. It gives us more sense of agency when we exercise. So all of this can be very useful to us. Some of it comes from the early tradition. Some of it, I think, are things that we can take from the tradition and expand upon. And if you're interested in hearing more about what the Buddha had to say about fear and anxiety, I'll leave a link to that earlier video up here on the screen. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that we're all doing here together. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.